Be not afraid. Do not fear, for I am with you. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Don't worry. Be happy. Hakuna Matata. These familiar spiritual and secular orientations to fear, they have ingrained in me this idea that to be a brave, courageous person, to be a devoted, faithful person, one must become so enlightened that fears simply, poof, they go away. Or is it maybe that one must just choose not to listen or engage in one's fears, come whatever may? Ironically, this socio-cultural and religious counsel about fear has birthed a fear all its own for me. I fear that I will never attain the spiritual maturity to, quote, be not afraid. And this anxiety gets louder when I share a worry with someone and they dismiss it or minimize it, insisting that I have nothing to be afraid of, even when my mind and body shout otherwise. So many of our bodies and minds are carrying a constant current of fear these days. Perhaps this is because we find ourselves in a relentless cycle of news that brings anticipatory stress about an unpredictable future. We find ourselves living in tumultuous times with high stakes geopolitical events. Beloveds, I want you to know that this fear you have and its accompanying stress coursing through your bodies, this fear is real and it is valid. This year, 2024, is the biggest election year in history, with more than 60 countries representing half of the world's population going to the polls. The outcomes of these elections are going to shape and sharpen our unsettled world, which is why some political scientists have labeled 2024 as a make or break year for democracy worldwide. So it's no surprise that many of us are feeling this tumultuous sensation of what some call the polar coaster, Poller, which is the emotional up and down of following very close election polls. And for those of us who don't engage in a close following of the polls or the news, there is the daily discomfort of what I also call the polar coaster, Pollar, the polar coaster, which is the anxiety and tension of living in polarized times, where there are conflicts across political, economic, social, and cultural divides. But beyond these external stressors of fear-ridden social political landscape, there are also the everyday stressors of our most frightful interpersonal, private landscape. These are the fears that come in so many shapes and sizes and all varieties, each creating a common soundtrack in the background of our lives. And while the external worries we frequently talk about with one another are real and they are valid, the personal panics we share are actually the afflictions that most feel acute. These are the disquieting and deeply intimate fears that accompany being alive. When we listen to them, they sound like this. I am afraid of disappointment. I am afraid of being a disappointment. I am afraid of being alone. I am afraid of dying alone. I'm afraid I'm failing as a parent. I'm afraid of the results of a biopsy. I'm afraid I'm not making the right decisions for my aging parent. I'm afraid my marriage might be over. I'm afraid I don't have enough money for tomorrow. I'm afraid of my anger. I'm afraid of losing my independence and autonomy. I'm afraid of losing my home to a wildfire. I'm afraid to let it all out. I'm afraid if I slow down, it will all catch up to me. I'm afraid I'm broken. I'm afraid I'm not enough. I'm afraid I am not loved or lovable. I'm afraid. You see, beloveds, when I listen and live in integrity, I must come to accept that it's neither possible nor spiritually wise to be free of fear. The more honest spiritual truth is that which Pema Chodron reminds us: the ground has always been shaky. And it is indeed very hard to listen and name what makes the ground beneath us so frightening. What if the spiritual art lies in not pretending to be unafraid, but in listening to that which makes us afraid? If we listened to our fears, what spiritual wisdom would we hear? Our bodies are always listening to our fears and constantly assessing our world for threats. We have a built-in alarm system, our autonomic nervous system, and it has so much intelligence to keep us safe and free from harm. Ideally, this system activates only in true emergencies, but in reality, it is often responding to any form of fear or discomfort, not just our major traumatic events. Emotional distress, the feelings in the I am afraid of ... These can set off our survival instincts to protect ourselves too. Sometimes we might respond with a fight instinct. This is when we take a fighter's stance and our bodies activate to confront and defend against perceived threats. Sometimes we find ourselves in a moment where we might want to yell, scream, or attack. But if we listen to that fighter in us, we can hear it intelligently asserting, I won't let you harm me or my loved ones. Other times we might flee, preparing to escape from threats. My body does this when I try to keep safe by running away. And when we're in this flight mode, getting ready to leave, we might feel restless, fidgety, seeking to avoid that which frightens us. But when we listen to that flight response, we hear that it too has intelligence we need. For it says, I need to get out of here fast. And then, of course, there are moments when we freeze. This is when we try to block out that looming threat. We might feel blank, struggle to think or speak, and maybe even prefer to duck down and hide. But even in this state, where I think you can't see me, there is an intelligence, the intelligence of our frozen selves saying, if I stay still and quiet, maybe that scary thing won't find me. And then finally, there's a fawn response, F-A-W-N, fawn. This is when we attempt to appease fear by being overly accommodating or friendly, hoping to mitigate the scary threat. The fawn part within us expresses this beautiful intelligence, one that says, hey, I just want everyone to get along. These four protective postures, fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, these are so very normal. They guide our brains and our bodies in how to listen to our fear and navigate distressing situations or conflicts. Yet there is often an unacknowledged fifth response. This response not only seeks individual safety, but also embodies deep spiritual wisdom for communal care. It is a posture that is both protective and prayerful, individual and communal. And I believe it's this fifth response that most aligns us with our shared values of Unitarian Universalism, because it calls us to live in covenant and engage with ourselves and others in loving ways. This is a posture that I call flocking. Flocking is the faithful commitment, the commitment to listen to where pain assails us, where fear and frustration ascend upon us, and where regret, loss, and disappointment afflict us. Flocking is also a relational antidote to the ways in which fear can become weaponized. By trusting fear as a tool, not a weapon, for connection, compassion, and care. Flocking is what happens when we take vulnerable risks in our community to give voice to that which we are most afraid of. And in doing so, with flocking, we can harness the transformative power of what it means to be in a covenantal faith community, one where we get to practice the spiritual art of giving voice to our fears so we can name it to tame it. Flocking is the embodied spiritual wisdom that knows if we are going to orient ourselves and our loved ones towards safety, connection, and belonging, then we are also called to befriend our fears. Our fears can guide us to what we truly need, especially in the times when our most very scared and defensive self needs connection and reassurance the most. And beloveds, this community, you all know how to flock. Flocking manifests when you receive a card from the care team after you risk sharing a personal sorrow. It happens each week when you bring food for coffee hour, ensuring that no one leaves hungry or goes home to eat alone. It happens when we deepen our connection to share the plate by giving not only our monetary treasures, but also our time to these local nonprofits. And flocking can find great scale when we join our larger faith movement by sending postcards, over 2,000 of them, to UU the Vote. Flocking is what it means to be a part of a church community. It's the part of us that knows how important it is to both give and receive care. The kind of care that listens to fear and responds with love. And in doing so, shares the spiritual intelligence that says, feel it to heal it together. Feel it to heal it together. So, beloveds, if you can commit yourself to flocking even in these very frightening times, I ask you now to show it to one another. You can raise your arms up and down. Show one another how we flock. And take a moment to look around. Notice all of the people beside you who are smiling at you today. And in the rising and falling of us finding our wings, beloveds, let us take a moment to be honest. It is okay to be afraid. For how else are we going to learn how to smile at our fear? How else do we learn how to feel it, to heal it together? When we are frightened, we can flock as a faith.